What is a remote camera? Why would you use one? And how do you set it up? I'm going to tell you all about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you know what to do. Just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form right there on the site. I just might pick your question to answer right here on a future show. Today's question was sent in by Jamie B, and he wants to know, during your concert shoots, you put remote cameras around the stage and in the lighting rigs. Can you cover the process and products you use to remotely fire the cameras and the grip you use to mount them? Thanks. Sure thing, Jamie. Thanks so much for sending in that question. Now, I've done videos about remotes before, but I'm going to get into some more detail today. This is going to be a long one, so hang in for the whole thing if you really want to know how to set up remote cameras. And before I get into the gear itself, let me briefly talk about what remotes are for the photographers who don't know what we're talking about. Now, all a remote camera is, it's just a normal camera that you put somewhere else and fire it remotely. They're most commonly used in sports photography. Once you start playing around with remotes, you might find your own creative ways to use the technology. Now, as I started shooting more and more concerts about 15 or 20 years ago, I brought these techniques with me into the music world, and now I set up at least one remote camera pretty much every night when I'm on tour. Now, there are two main reasons you might use a remote camera. The first one is so you can put a camera in a position where you wouldn't normally be able to shoot. Over the backboard at a basketball game, for example. Obviously, you couldn't physically be up there during a game. It's very common for photographers to put remotes behind the net at a soccer match or under the railing at a finish line of a horse race, places like that where you couldn't stand while the event is going on. The idea is that you're shooting photos somewhere else, but you can trigger that camera when you think the action is happening in front of it. And as a sports photographer, you don't want to miss any of the action, so you could actually be in two places at once you've got a remote camera set up. Now, of course, keep in mind that there are often rules about where you can and cannot put cameras, especially when we're talking about professional sports leagues. You don't want to put a camera up somewhere without permission because the safety of the athletes and the fans is always number one. And I'm going to talk about safety cables and some other things like that when we get further down into gear, but always keep that in mind before you set up a remote. Now, the other reason to use remotes is that you can set up multiple cameras and fire them all at once. When Bon Jovi opened the new Meadowlands Stadium in New Jersey a bunch of years ago, they had some pyro planned for the end of a particular song. It was only 1 minute long and was going to happen only at that one show. Now, as the band's tour photographer at the time, I needed to make the best photos of that big moment. It's hard to know exactly which angle is going to look best, so I set up a bunch of remote cameras all around the stadium. Now, I stood on stage and made this shot when it happened, but I also had this, and even this. And I had a few more on top of that, also all from remote cameras. Okay, so now that you know what a remote camera is and why you might use it, let's get to Jamie's question about the gear to make it happen. First thing you need, of course, is a camera and a lens. Now, you should try to visualize the photo you want to make so you pick the right focal length of lens to use. Don't underestimate the importance of visualizing. If you're going to go through all the trouble of setting up a remote, then you should try to make an awesome photo if you're going to do all that. Now, you probably won't be able to access the camera or make any changes during the event itself, so choose wisely. Wide-angle lenses like this one are common, especially if you don't know exactly where your subject is going to be. My current camera and lens combination for my remote on stage is right here, this Canon EOS R5 with a 15 to 35 millimeter lens. Now, sometimes you might use longer lenses like a 70 to 200, for example, when setting up something like an overhead remote looking down on the action from up in the rafters. But I like to shoot wide to show the whole venue and the crowd. Now, before I get into the gear to mount and trigger the camera, let me talk about settings. I set my exposure manually. I mostly base that on experience and can usually get it pretty close. You don't want it on auto anything because, especially at a concert, the light is changing constantly. When the spotlights hit into that lens, it would darken down my exposure drastically. But I'm exposing for the people, and that light doesn't actually change very much. I'm also shooting raw, so I've got some latitude on exposure, but there will be some frames that are just too far under or overexposed because of that huge shift in lighting at a concert. That doesn't happen so much in sports, so manual works really well when you're shooting there. Now, something I should mention is that you never want to depend on a remote shot to be your primary picture. It's a bonus shot. There is a lot that can go wrong. Even though I've been setting up remotes for decades, there are still times when something just happens and the shot doesn't work. It can get bumped, the camera can actually get bumped. I might line it up wrong, I might set something up wrong. There can be radio interference and it doesn't fire, and on and on. A great remote shot is a bonus. You should still be making the most important pictures from your handheld cameras, but a really unique remote image, if you pull it off, can add some really great pizzazz to your coverage of an event. Now, as for focus, it really depends on what you're shooting. For sports, it's most common to preset your focus manually based on where you anticipate the action happening. Again, you'll get better at that with experience, but a play at home plate in baseball or a slam dunk in basketball, you should be able to imagine where those pictures are going to happen. You don't want to lose any time with the camera trying to find focus or risk it focusing on the wrong person. For a concert though, I usually use autofocus. I'm shooting wide and the person I'm photographing could be anywhere in a big area in front of my lens throughout the show. So I just let the camera do its thing. This Canon R5 is honestly the best remote camera I've ever used because the autofocus is just so good. It can scan the entire frame very quickly, and I have it set to look for a person. I'm using subject detection and it's looking for a person. It's going to look for an eye first. If it doesn't find an eye, it's going to look for a face or a head or a body. It just does an incredible job finding my subject. I also have my camera set to shoot high-speed bursts so I can capture all of the action. I know I'm going to shoot a lot of frames, but it's digital and I've got big cards in there. So if I take 1,000 pictures during a concert and I get one awesome frame, that's all I need. Now, let's get to the hardware you need to mount your remote. The simplest type of remote is a floor cam, usually a wide-angle shot all the way down on the ground. It's a big epic shot that makes your subject look powerful and also can shoot the entire venue, whether it's a small club or a giant stadium. If you just sit the camera on the ground, it won't be pointed right. It's going to be actually pointed straight or even a little bit down. So you've got to find a way to angle it up just a little bit. A little trick that some of the Sports Illustrated photographers use is simply taking, right here, 2 AA batteries. And what you can do is take these 2 batteries, put them negative to negative, just like that, and then taping them together with a little bit of Gaffer Tape. Just take some Gaffer Tape, tape it around there, so you've got this nice little riser that you can use. Of course, you can use almost anything to do this, but once you have this taped together, you get this nice little platform. You can tape this to the bottom of your camera and then move it forward or backward depending on where you want it to get that exact angle of your camera. You'll see once it's under there, this is going to aim up just a little bit, just enough so that you can get that angle when it's down all the way on the ground. Now, that's going to work great if the camera is going to be close to you or if it's in a place where no one can touch it. But there are some more secure ways to do this too. You could actually use a floor plate with a ball head. I like this one. This is the Platypod. This is what I've been using for a long time. This is actually an older model, one of their first models, but they do have a few different versions today that work great. I've put some sticky rubberized material here on the bottom. That's just, from any home store, you can get that stuff just so it doesn't slide around when I put this down on the ground. And then I use a Manfrotto ball head attached to this Platypod. Just screw that right on there, and then I can put the camera on top of this and aim it however I want. This is a pretty lightweight setup that works really well with just a body and a wide angle lens with not a whole lot of weight. You should use a bigger floor plate and a heavy-duty ball head if you're using longer and heavier lenses. I still have a couple of these old Slick ball heads. These were made by Slick. These are big, heavy-duty ball heads. Unfortunately, they don't make these anymore. I do occasionally see them in Adorama's used department. So if you've got a big, heavy lens that you want to put on a ball head, this is definitely the thing to get. Keep your eye open from that Adorama used department. Now, if you're mounting a camera somewhere other than the floor, you need to have something to attach it to. Then once you figure out exactly what you're going to attach it to, you're going to use something like this. Actually, you're going to use exactly this. This is a Manfrotto super clamp. It's kind of the industry standard for grip gear. And what you do is you can put this around any kind of a surface, any kind of a bar or something like that, and then you screw this thing down right here, and it's going to tighten up. You can pretty much attach this to anything. Just be careful though, because you want it to be tight enough so it doesn't move, move, but you can also scratch or you could even bend metal if you clamp this thing too hard. Never put it onto something that you don't want to damage. I've attached this to the stage, to railings, to lighting trusses, and even drum mic stands. But I've never put it on the drum stands themselves because it's definitely going to mess those up. You could definitely bend them or scratch them, and you don't want to do that. Then, if you have a short distance between the camera and whatever you're clamped to, you can just attach a ball head directly to the super clamp. You take this ball head right here, attach it right on there, and you've got a nice little platform that you can use here. The super clamp usually comes with this little post here, and you can flip this over depending on which kind of screw you have in your ball head here, and just make sure you've got the right one. And then once this is together, you've got a nice secure setup that you can attach to almost anything, and this thing is going to be really secure. Now, if you need some more space between the clamp and your camera, then you need to step up to this. I love this thing. This is a Manfrotto magic arm, and you attach it to the super clamp, right? Just like that, instead of using the ball head. There are two versions of this one, by the way. This is the one that you want. This is called the variable friction magic arm. It has a tightening wheel on it. The other one has sort of like this ratchet on it. Just doesn't work very well. When it comes loose, it's never really going to get back tight again. So you should definitely buy this one, and you can get it with a camera platform on it, which is this right here. I'm going to link to all this stuff in the description down below. Now, what this magic arm does, it allows you to attach the camera to it, and then you can angle it however you want once you've got the other end clamped down, and then all you do is you tighten this down with the friction wheel, and everything locks into place. So obviously this is going to give you unlimited angles to place your camera. Just be aware that you're putting a lot of weight at the end of this thing. When you've got this heavy camera on there, you're going to have a lot of weight on the end of this thing. You probably don't want to angle it straight out like this. That's not a good idea. You can tighten it down, but you know, this weight is going to be a problem down at this end. So you probably don't want to do it like that. It's better to either hang it down or even have another mounting point to balance out some of the weight. For longer and heavier lenses, really big, long, heavy lenses, I recommend to use two mounting points. You could have one clamp with a ball head on the lens, tripod foot, that foot that's on the big on those big lenses, and then a second clamp with a magic arm attached to the body. That's going to be super safe and secure. Now, speaking of safety, you should always be your number one concern. Safety is always the thing you need to think about. Not so much for a floor remote, obviously, but anytime you're hanging a camera or it's over people or over the field of play, you need to make sure that it's not going to fall. Make sure everything is tight and clean when you set it up so that nothing is hanging out. But also, you should definitely use safety cables. Something like this. Now, for a really lightweight setup, you could probably just use your camera strap. Make sure it's attached very securely and then wrap it around something solid, just to, in case the super clamp breaks or loses its grip. Even better than the strap, though, is to use an actual cable like this. This is a steel safety cable with a carabiner attached to the end. Now, sometimes what I'll do is I'll put little key rings on my cameras here, those little metal key rings, and then you can actually slide the safety cable through there and attach these, loop them through, and attach it up to some mounting point where you're working. Now, don't be that photographer that has a remote camera fall, right? If you have a really heavy camera, you probably don't want to use key rings. I've seen photographers use zip ties, those big heavy-duty zip ties that are going to hold like 100 pounds, right? So, and then use a metal safety cable like this. You do not want to be that photographer that has a remote camera fall. Make sure there's nothing loose on your camera. Even remove lens hoods or tape them on if you need them on the camera. All it takes is one screw up and you could have serious trouble. At minimum, no one is ever going to be allowed to set up a remote again. Of course, the worst case scenario is that someone actually gets hurt or even killed. You don't want a heavy camera falling from an arena ceiling. Have somebody double check it if you're not sure, somebody who knows rigging and can make sure that that thing is secure and not going to fall down. Okay, so with that out of the way, the last part is how to actually trigger the camera. If it's closest to you, the easiest and safest way is to just use a cable. I forgot to mention that you need to use a camera that has a remote release port on it. Most mid-level to high-end cameras have one. Here it is on my R5, this port right here in the front. But some entry-level cameras might not have that port, so you won't be able to trigger it remotely unless you actually reach down and push the button, which is certainly an option if the camera's right in front of you. But it's definitely easier to do with a cable. Canon makes, if I can find it here in all my stuff, here we go. Canon makes a very simple remote cable. that you can use. You just need to make sure that you get the right one for your camera, since these plugs are proprietary. Some photographers also like to build their own cables. If you're electronically inclined, you can put a button on the end to press down and shoot. I used to tape this to the side of my camera, or one of those other kind of cables that I have a few of still in my bag, and I would tape it to the side, so that way when something's happening, I can make the decision whether I want to hit the remote or hit the transmitter. Pocket Wizard also used to make a foot pedal. I've actually never used this. I bought this years ago, still in the bag. But this is good for something like baseball, where you're sitting down and you're shooting with a long lens, but maybe you have a wider lens pointed from another angle at home plate. When there's a play at the plate, you can shoot with your long lens, but then also trigger the remote by pressing down on your foot. Now, hardwiring is definitely the safest way to trigger a camera, and I prefer to do that whenever possible. However, most of the time, the remote is just too far away from me, or it's impractical to run a cable. So that's when you get into radio triggers. Pocket Wizard is by far the industry standard for remotes. You need two to make it work. One to transmit the signal and one to receive the signal. They do allow you to pick different frequencies on these things, so if there are multiple photographers covering the same event, you can coordinate so that everyone is using a different frequency and you don't fire each other's remotes. Now, the most recent Pocket Wizard models are called transceivers because they can work as both a transmitter and a receiver. I use this, the +3 and the +4 models. They're basically the same except for the shape. I attached a little S-hook to my +3 here, and I actually wear it from my pass during the show. I put the +4 on the camera because it's a bit more low profile and just kind of doesn't stick up as high, so I like to keep it down low. I do believe the range is similar on the 3s and the 4s. I haven't had any issues with the 3s or the 4s triggering from a distance. Now, I do need to point out, it seems that these models are actually hard to find these days. I heard that Pocket Wizard is working on a new model to replace them, and I hope that'll be out sometime in 2024. But for now, the only thing I can find is the +X. That's actually their simplest and cheapest radio trigger. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of the 3 and the 4, but it works fine for simply triggering a remote camera. There are other companies now making competing products, but honestly, I haven't used any of them, so I can't talk about their reliability. Pocket Wizard was always the way to go. Anyway, the only other thing you need is the cable from the receiver. Here we go. The cable from the receiver to the trigger port in the camera. You can put the receiver in the hot shoe if you want. I like to put it up there just to keep it up there so it's close to the camera, but it really doesn't have anything to do with taking the picture. You still need to go through that port. You take this cord and you want to hook it to the Wizard that's on your hot shoe and then into that port in the camera. Remember, these cameras do have proprietary ports, so you have to get the right Pocket Wizard cable for your camera. They do have a cable finder on their site, so you can make sure you're getting the correct one for your camera. There's also a special thing that they sell, Pocket Wizard sells, called a pre-trigger cable, this little thing here. This is a little add-on that you can buy and you attach it to one of their regular cables. They call it, this is called the PTMM adapter. The problem you might have when you're shooting sports action is that the camera goes to sleep. It actually goes into economy mode. So it goes to sleep, energy saver mode, I should say. And taking a picture with the Wizard does wake it up, but that might take a half a second to happen just to wake up the camera and start to shoot. And you might miss the peak action moment in that time. The pre-trigger cable has a little box on it, and it says it has an on or off. And when you set it to on, it's basically the same as continuously half pressing the shutter button to keep the camera from going into energy saver mode. So when you take a picture, it's immediately ready to fire. The only downside is that it eats up battery since the camera never goes to sleep. You have to gauge the size battery of your camera and if it's going to last the entire game or concert. For big sporting events like the Olympics or the NBA Finals, the remote cameras sometimes have to go up and be approved days or even weeks ahead of time. They'll often use AC adapters and run power to those cameras so they don't have to worry about batteries. For me, shooting concerts, I don't need that split-second action like I did with sports, so I don't use a pre-trigger cable and just let the camera go to sleep, and it wakes up when I go ahead and push the button Here we go. This button right here is gonna be hanging from my pass. I just put that button, it's gonna wake it up, and it's gonna start shooting pretty quickly. I'm not gonna miss really anything. Also, remember that pushing the trigger is the same as pushing the shutter button on your camera. So if you're like me and you use back button focus, but you also want the remote to autofocus, you need to put the focus function back onto the shutter button. Otherwise, it won't activate the focus function when you take pictures. Also, I highly recommend using Gaffer Tape. Gaffer Tape, great investment. Buy a few rolls of this thing. You'll use it for so many different things. You want to use this to tape anything down that can move. I'm talking about the focus ring and the zoom ring on your lens, right? All these rings here, all that stuff, you want to tape those down. Any dials and things on your camera that aren't locked down, anything, especially if the camera is near other people. You don't want anyone to touch it. Some curious hands might actually touch it, either purposely or by accident, or have anything slip once you've got everything into place. If your zooms in or zooms out, it's gonna change your positioning, and you don't want that. So now that I'm all set up, during the show, if I'm out front taking pictures and the lead singer turns around toward my remote, all I have to do is reach up and push this button. That's all I have to do. The wizard's hanging from my pass. I can do that very quickly. It's muscle memory. Now, and that way I can get a picture. I can choose if I want the picture from my handheld or from that remote on stage. Now, let's say I actually go up on stage and I want to shoot a tight shot with my handheld camera at the same time that I want to shoot the wide shot from the remote. I actually can put the transmitter on the hot shoe on my camera, and what that's going to do is when I take the picture with my handheld camera, pretend this is the handheld, it's going to activate the wizard, and then it's also going to trigger my remote at the same time. Remember before I said I only put the receiver on the hot shoe just for basically for convenience, but it doesn't actually trigger the camera. The transmitter, the one that I'm sending the signal with, I can put on my handheld camera, and when I take the picture, the hot shoe is going to trigger this, and it's going to send the signal to the receiver that's on the camera. In this case, it's going to be this +4 on the camera there, and it's going to trigger both at the same time. Of course, I can buy more pocket wizards and put them on as many cameras as I want. As long as I set them all on the same radio frequency, they're all going to fire at the same time, like I did with those Bon Jovi fireworks shots. By the way, some cameras have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth built in, and you can take pictures using an app on your phone. That's super cool. Canon has the Canon Camera Connect app. That's great for taking selfies or something where you've got time to line up your photo and focus, and you want to see it right away. But honestly, for any kind of action like sports or concerts, you just want to push the button and take photos immediately. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are just too slow to react, and you're going to miss that peak action. So Jamie, I think that covers it. I know it sounds pretty complex, and when you're first starting out, it absolutely can be. I recommend setting everything up at home first to make sure you've got all the little bits and bobs and all the pieces to make it work. Make sure your batteries are fully charged and you've got a card in the camera. Remember, safety is number one. If everything goes right, you just might make some awesome pictures from really unique locations. Have you ever shot with a remote camera? How did it turn out? Any other tips for someone starting out that I didn't cover here? Let me know down in the comments below. Remember, you can send in your own photo question by going to AskDavidBergman.com and filling out that form. If you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, go ahead and click that subscribe button and hit the little bell icon. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope you'll come back next time when I'll have another question to answer right here on Ask David Bergman.